Hello, and welcome to this live read of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Today we'll be reading chapters 23 and 24 of the book. So let's begin. Chapter 23, Captured. Speaking of schedules and countdowns, Mr. Ages spoke suddenly. We've got one for this evening. It's getting late. The clock on Nicodemus's desk said 5 o'clock. Mrs. Fitzgibbons feeds dragon at 6 p.m. He spoke gently, but his voice had a chilling sound to Mrs. Frisby. They all looked at her. I'm ready, she said, quietly. But there's still a few minutes, and one question you haven't yet answered. Why did Jonathan never tell me anything about Nimh, or any of the rest? Mr. Ages said, I'll try to explain. When Nicodemus and the others moved into the cave near the rose bush, they invited Jonathan and me to stay with them. After all, we had been with them for many months by that time. And at first we did, but after a few weeks we decided to move out. We were, he realized, different. We both felt strange, associating always and only with rats, even though they were our close and good friends. As for me, I wanted more solitude and less society. Jonathan, on the other hand, he was younger than I, and he felt lonely. So we moved at first together to the basement of the old farmhouse where I still live. And then Jonathan met you at a stream near the woods somewhere. I think he said, Yes, Mrs. Frisby said. I remember. Well, from then on, he worried. He didn't want to be secretive, but he didn't know how to tell you one thing. I'm sure Nicodemus has explained to you that the injections we got at Nimh had two effects. One of them was that none of us seemed to be growing any older at all. Apparently, the injections had given us all a much longer lifespan than even Dr. Schultz had anticipated. But you can see why this would have been a dreadful thing for Jonathan to have to tell you. You never had the injections. That meant that while he stayed young, you would grow old and older and finally die. He loved you. He could hardly stand that thought. Yet it was distressing to him. He thought how much more painful it would be to you. That is, what he could not bring himself to tell you. He would have told you eventually. I know he intended to. Indeed, you would have found it out yourself. You would have seen it happening. But it was hard. He kept putting it off, and then, finally, it was too late. Poor Jonathan, said Mrs. Frisby. He should have told me. I wouldn't have minded. But will my children also have longer lives? Said Nicodemus. We don't know yet. We think so. But our own children aren't yet old enough to be certain. We do know that they have inherited the ability to learn. They master reading almost without any effort. He stood up, took out his reading glass, and looked at the clock. But Mrs. Frisby interrupted again. One more thing, she said. What happened to Jenner? Nicodemus said, He left. He was against the plan from the start. In our discussions, he tried to persuade others to oppose it too, and only a few joined him, though there are some others who are still doubtful about it. They're going to stay with us and try it. The argument stayed reasonably friendly, but the last straw for Jenner was when we decided to destroy the machines. Destroy them? Yes, for two reasons. One, so that if anyone ever finds the cave, there won't be any evidence of what we've been doing. Nothing but broken bits of metal. We'll pull out our electric cable, our lights, our water pipes. We'll close up all the tunnels leading in. But the other reason is more important. When we move to Thorn Valley, we're going to have some hard times. We know that. We're braced for it. If this cave is still open, with the machines and lights, carpets and running water still here, there will be a terrible temptation to give up and move back to this soft life. We want to remove that temptation. But when Jenner heard the decision, it was made in a meeting, he grew really angry. He denounced us all as idiots and dreamers. He stamped out of the meeting, and a few days later he left the group forever, taking 6 of his followers with him. We don't know where they went, but We think that they're going to try and find some place where they can set up a new life like this one. I wish them luck, but they'll have trouble. There won't be any toy tinker this time. They'll have to steal their machines and everything. That worries us some, because if they get caught, who knows what might happen, but there's nothing we can do about it. We're going ahead with the plan, and once we get to Thorn Valley, I think we can stop worrying. Justin stood up. It's time to go. He picked up the paper with a sleeping draft in it. Mrs. Frisby, Justin, and Mr. Ages walked together up the long corridor to the rose bush. Remember, when you come up through the hole in the kitchen floor, Mrs. Ages said, you'll be under a cabinet. It's low, but there's room to move. Go a few steps forward, and you'll be able to see out into the room. Mrs. Fitzgibbons will be there, getting dinner for her family. They eat at about 6. When she's got their dinner ready, she'll feed Dragon. He won't be in the kitchen, but he'll be waiting just outside the kitchen door on the porch. She doesn't let him in while she's cooking, because he makes such a pest of himself, rubbing against her ankles and getting between her feet. If you look to your right, you'll see his bowl. It's blue. It has the word kitty written over it again and again on the side. She'll pick it up, fill it with cat food, and put it down again in the same place. Watch closely. She'll walk over to the door to let him in, and that is your chance. Her back will be towards you. She's got to walk about 20 feet. It's a big kitchen. The bowl will be about 2 feet away from you, but be sure the paper packet is open. Dash out, dump the powder into the food, and dash back. You don't want to be in sight when Dragon comes in. I can tell you that from experience. Is that how you got hurt? I got there a few seconds late. I decided there was still time. I was wrong. At the arch and the rose bush, Mr. Ages left them. With his cast, he wouldn't be able to climb through the hole in the kitchen. There was no point in his going any farther. Mrs. Frisby and Justin moved out the rose bush and looked around them. It was still light, though the sun was low on the horizon. Straight ahead of them, perhaps 200 feet away, stood the big white farmhouse. Dragon was already on the porch, sitting just outside the door, looking at it expectantly. To their right was the tractor shed. Beyond that was a barnyard fence and the barn itself, casting a long shadow. Behind them rose the wood and the mountains. To the left, Mrs. Frisby could see the big stone in the middle of the garden, near which her children waited. As soon as her task was done, she thought, she must hurry to them and get ready to move. We go under the right side of the house, Justin said quietly. Follow me. They made their way around the edge of the yard, staying in the shadows, keeping an eye on Dragon. Justin still wore his satchel and had put the powder package in it. There was a basement under the main part of the Fitzgibbons' house, but the big kitchen had been added later and stood on a foundation of concrete blocks, with only a crawl space beneath. As they approached the gray foundation, Mrs. Frisby saw that near the middle of it, a few inches off the ground, there was a square patch of dark sky. It was a hole, left for ventilation. There was a screen over it. When they reached it, Justin caught hold of the screen and pulled the corner. It swung open. We loosened it a bit, he explained, holding it open to her. Mrs. Frisby crept through. Careful, he said. It's dark. There's a drop of about a foot. Just jump. We put some straw at the bottom so it's soft. Holding her breath, Mrs. Frisby jumped blindly into the blackness and felt the cushion of straw under her feet. In a moment, Justin landed beside her. They were under the Fitzgibbons' kitchen. Now, he said softly, look to your left. See the patch of light? That's the hole. The light comes from the kitchen. We've piled dirt up under it so it's easy to reach. Come on. Mrs. Frisby followed him. As they got near the bright hole, she could see around her a little. They were walking across bare earth, dry and cool to the touch. Overhead, there were heavy wooden beams holding up the floor. Above them, the floorboards themselves. Under the hole rose a small round hill of dirt. They walked up this, and then Justin just whispered, This is as far as I can go. There's not room for me to get through, so I'll wait here. Come back down as soon as you're finished. Here's the powder. Remember, tear it open before you go out to Dragon's bowl. Hurry now. I can hear Mrs. Fitzgibbons moving around. She's getting the dinner. Be careful, and good luck. Mrs. Frisby first pushed the packet up through the hole, and then, as quietly as she could, grasping both sides, she pulled herself up and into the kitchen. It was light there, but Mr. Ages had not been joking when he said the ceiling was low. There was less than an inch between the floor and the bottom of the cabinet, so that she could not walk properly, but had to flatten herself out and crawl. She did a few steps, and she discovered that she was trembling. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Don't get panicky, or you'll do something foolish and spoil everything." Thus admonished, she crept forward again until she was near the edge of the cabinet. She stopped. From there she could see out into the kitchen fairly well. Straight across from her stood a great big white gas stove, and in front of it, putting the lid on a pot, was Mrs. Fitzgibbon. Because the edge of the cabinet was so low, Mrs. Frisby couldn't see her head, but only up to her shoulders. "There," Mrs. Fitzgibbon said to herself. "The stew is done, bread's in the oven, table set. Where was the cat's bowl?" Mrs. Frisby looked to her right, as Mr. Ages had said, and there it was, blue, with words inscribed across the side. Yet something was wrong. It wasn't 2 feet from the cabinet, more like 4 or 5 in the corner, where it should have been, rose 4 wooden table legs. She realized she was looking at the bottom of a kitchen stool. "No matter," she thought. "The extra distance is just a couple of feet." Mr. Ages hadn't mentioned a stool, but perhaps they moved it around. She crawled to her right, as close to the bowl as she could without showing herself, and tore open the package. Just as she did this, Mrs. Fitzgibbon walked over from the stove. Her hand appeared, picked up the bowl. Mrs. Frisby heard it thump on the counter over her head. A cutting sound, a can opener, the scrape of a spoon. The bowl was back on the floor. The strong, fishy smell of cat food. Mrs. Fitzgibbon walked away. "Now." Mrs. Frisby moved swiftly out into the room, across the open floor, holding the powder, her eyes intent only on the bowl. She was no longer trembling. She poured in the powder, which instantly dissolved in the moist cat food. Still clutching the paper, she turned and sped toward the cabinet. With a bang, the lights went dim. The ceiling, which had somehow become curved, was filled with little round mounds. Mrs. Frisby kept running, and her face struck a cold, hard wall of metal. A voice shouted, "Mother! Don't let Drag get in yet! I've caught a mouse!" Billy, the younger Fitzgibbon son, had been sitting on the kitchen stool, his feet up on the rung, eating berries from a colander. The colander, upside down, was now over Mrs. Frisby. 7 dead rats. From a bird cage, Mrs. Frisby watched the Fitzgibbons eat dinner. There was dinner for her, too. Breadcrumbs, cheese, and a bit of carrot on the floor of the cage, along with a small bowl of water. The cage had been occupied until a few months before by a yellow canary named Porgy, who had lived in it for 5 years, and then died. To get her out from under the colander, Billy had slid a piece of cardboard beneath it, pinching her foot sharply in the process so that it hurt when she walked. She had been transferred first to a shoebox. "Can I keep it?" Billy had asked his mother. "What for? It's just a field mouse." "For a pet. I like it." Billy had tried to look Mrs. Frisby through some holes he had punched in the top of the box, but it was dark inside. "Oh, I suppose so, for a few days. You'll have to feed it. I think I'll put it in Porgy's cage. I can see it in this box. It must be hungry. It's trying to eat Dragon's food. Dumb mouse. Must have been killed." No one had noticed the small torn piece of paper at first, and then Mrs. Fitzgibbons had absently picked it up and tossed it in the wastebasket. A few days? Mrs. Frisby felt sick. After a few days, then what? Would they just let her go? Or would Billy plead for a few more? But even if they did set her free, her children were alone. The rats were coming tonight to move her house. Why had Billy picked today of all days to sit on the stool? She hadn't the heart to eat the food that lay on the cage floor. She felt like weeping. Paul came in for dinner, followed by his father. He looked at her in the cage. "Why don't you just let it go?" he said to Billy. "Poor little thing, it's scared to death." "No, it's not. It's just not used to the cage." "I bet it'll die." "I bet it won't. You can't just put wild animals in cages. You have to catch them when they're babies." "They do it in zoos." "Yes, but now they know more about it. Anyway, a lot of those things die too." "It's strange that was in here at all," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "I haven't seen any signs of mice. I didn't think we had any." They sat at the table, and Mrs. Fitzgibbon served the stew. It was a long, square-cut farm table, big enough to feed, beside her family, the 4 hired hands who would be working with Mr. Fitzgibbon during the planting and harvesting. The Fitzgibbons sat together around one end of it. Mrs. Frisby's cage hung from a metal stand in the corner on the opposite side of the room, quite high up, so that the floor, where she crouched, was above their heads. She could watch them looking down, but if she retreated to the far side of the cage, they couldn't see her. She kept hoping that Paul would resume the argument with Billy and win it, or at least convince Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgibbon that they should let her go. But Paul was now busy eating. So, moving quietly, she crept to the back of the cage. There was a sliding door halfway up the side, which Billy had lifted to put her in. Remembering Nicodemus's story, she looked at it, wondering if she could climb it, if she could get it open if she did. Not now, but later, when they had left the kitchen. Maybe. It looked quite big and heavy. She thought about her children again. Surely, when Justin had waited a little longer, he would have realized that something had gone wrong. He would go and talk to them. But what could he tell them? "Children, your mother went into the kitchen with Dragon, and she hasn't come out." No. But whatever he said, they would be dreadfully frightened and worried. Poor Cynthia. Poor Timothy. Poor all of them. She had one small satisfaction. Dragon, who had been admitted after she was safely caged, had eaten his bowl of cat food greedily, sleeping powder and all, purring as he licked the last scraps from the bottom. Billy was looking at the cage. "There!" he cried. "It walked! I saw it! I told you it was all right!" He started up from his chair. "Billy, stay in your place and eat your stew," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "The mouse can wait." "Speaking of mice," he continued, "there was quite a stir today at Henderson's hardware store." "About mice?" "No, but nearly. About rats. I went in to order the new linchpin, and there was quite a group there, talking about an odd thing that had happened. It seems that 6 or 7 rats got themselves electrocuted there a few days ago. Really strange. Henderson sells motors. He has a whole shelf of them. The rats, for some reason, had got on the shelf. He says it looks as if they were fooling with one of the motors, trying to remove it." "Well, that's a new one," said Paul. "Rats stealing motors." "They weren't really, of course, but anyway, it happened during the night. When Henderson, came into the shop in the morning, he tried to turn on the lights, and the fuse was blown. He found the rats all grouped around the motor. It had been left plugged in, though it was turned off. They must have been gnawing on the insulation for some reason. At least that's what he thinks. They caused a short circuit, and all bunched together like that, the current went right through them, killed the lot." "Pretty good kind of rat trap, I'd say," Mrs. Fitzgibbon remarked. Mrs. Frisby was now listening to the conversation very closely. Dragon had stretched out on the floor, looking drowsy. "Wait," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "That's only the beginning. It seems the local weekly was hard up for news. They heard about it, and they sent their reporter over." "Fred Smith," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "Yeah, Fred. He wrote a little article about it, with the headline, 'Mechanized Rats Invade Hardware Store,' something like that. Well, it attracted more attention than he expected. The next thing they knew, believe it or not, the federal government got into it. They sent a squad over from the Public Health Service with a truckload of equipment." "Just on account of 7 rats?" said Billy. "They should send the truck over here. We've got more than that." "Well, that's just what I said," Mr. Fitzgibbon went on. "And do you know, they're going to." I was joking, of course, but the man in charge of the group, he didn't take it as a joke at all. He wanted to know where the farm was, how far away, how many acres, what I raised, how many rats I thought there were. He acted really interested. It seems they wanted to examine the dead rats at Henderson's, but they couldn't. He'd already sent them to the downtown dump. They were incinerated. "I never heard of such a thing," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "All that fuss over a few dead rats?" "I have," said Paul. "I bet I know what they're after." "What?" "They think the rats have rabies. They don't like to say so because it makes people panicky." "What's rabies?" asked Billy. "A disease," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "A very bad one, spread by animals. You know, Paul, I think you're probably right. That would explain why the Public Health Service is in on it. Epidemic control. Anyway, they're planning to check on the rats all over the area. Don't you remember, Paul said, a few years ago when everyone had to lock up their dogs? Some people were shooting every dog they saw. That's why they kept it quiet until they're sure. And another thing, they taught us in the vet course in school that when an animal starts acting strange, it may be a sign of rabies. Well, chewing electrical wires, that is strange enough. And they think some rats here might be infected? Mrs. Fitzgibbon sounded worried. I suppose they must, said Mr. Fitzgibbon, though they never mentioned rabies at all. Well, when are they coming? Day after tomorrow, Saturday morning. The man in charge, a doctor somebody, said they had some more checking to do in town tomorrow. They're coming with an extermination truck. Cyanide gas, I think. I can tell them where to look, Paul said. Me too, said Billy, under that rose bush. That's right, said Mr. Fitzgibbon. In fact, they'll probably want to bulldoze that bush out of there. I can do that with the big tractor. Bulldoze my rose bush, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. They will not. Look at it this way, her husband said. I've got to get rid of those rats anyway. I'd already decided to. They're stealing too much food. Seeds, too, more than all the time. If I paid an exterminator to do it, he would charge a couple $100. If the government will do it for free, why shouldn't we let them? Well, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon, still not soothed, then you can spend the money to buy me some new rose bushes. Well, that's just what I had in mind, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon with a smile. And maybe some lilacs, too. Mrs. Fitzgibbons had always wanted a lilac bush. They were her favorite shrubs. Mrs. Frisby did not believe at all that it was rabies the men were looking for. She wished Mr. Fitzgibbon had been able to remember the name of the doctor somebody. And now she had another urgent reason to get out of the cage. Somehow she had to warn Nicodemus. Dragon slept on the kitchen floor. Well, that's the end of that chapter. So we'll pick it up again on Monday at 1:30. Hope you enjoyed this reading, and I hope you have a nice weekend, and I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and safe. Until next time, see ya.